The dust from Mars that fell upon the Earth at the Exodus caused the waters to be bitter. It also made the waters lethally poisonous. According to John the Revelator, this plague will occur again. A third of all marine life will be killed by the so-called blood, and many men will die from drinking the tainted water. If the dust from Mars made the waters of the world bitter and toxic during the Exodus, and will do so again during the Apocalypse, then this can only mean that the dust itself must be poisonous. NASA hopes to eventually send men to Mars, but before they do that, they need to determine the conditions on the red planet, especially its habitability for human life. With this in mind, NASA has sent robotic probes to scout Mars and determine whether conditions will be hospitable to humans. The most recent and largest such mission is the Mars Science Laboratory, or MSL. MSL deployed the land rover, Curiosity, on the Martian surface in August of 2012. Curiosity is designed to perform a variety of scientific experiments with a primary objective of determining Mars' habitability. The testing of Martian soil is an integral part of the mission. NASA needs to determine its chemistry and mineralogical composition. Curiosity has a specially designed scooper to scoop up the Martian soil, making it available for analysis. Using the scooper and its array of instruments, Curiosity has determined the chemical composition of the dust on Mars. The results of Curiosity's soil analysis, which is consistent with previous probes, set off alarm bells in NASA. The dust on Mars is dangerously toxic and threatens any manned mission to the planet. NASA and other scientists have identified numerous dangerous aspects of Martian surface materials. The materials contain many dangerous elements and chemical compounds, but just the fact that Mars is covered with a fine dust is enough to give pause. When inhaled in large quantities, finely grained dust can cause serious damage to lung tissues. Human lungs are particularly at risk given several of the minerals and acids found in the dust. Perhaps the most dangerous toxic agent in Martian dust are the perchlorates, which are reactive compounds based upon chlorine and oxygen. Perchlorates, when ingested, affect thyroid function and can cause other serious maladies. Perchlorates are toxic to animals as well. Sodium perchlorate caused convulsions and paralysis in a variety of laboratory animals. Goldfish were killed when exposed to high concentrations of sodium perchlorate. It is no wonder, then, that all marine life will die during the apocalypse due to contact with the extremely high amount of dust that will fall into Earth's seas from the red planet above. Nor is it surprising that the bloody dust killed all the fish in the Nile and elsewhere in Egypt. Perchloric acids, found in high percentages in Martian soil, are corrosive agents. They can react with the eyes, lungs, and skin. Skin exposure can cause serious burns and irritation. One of the perchlorates found on Mars, potassium perchlorate, is particularly corrosive and can cause blistering and ulcerations. The red dust from Mars fell upon the livestock of Egypt, causing what the King James Version called a grievous murrain. The plague was tailored to strike only Egyptian cattle, while sparing that of the children of Israel. The Hebrew word translated as murrain is deber and means pestilence. Pestilence, in turn, refers to a deadly disease of epidemic proportions, like the bubonic plague of the Middle Ages. Other translations of the account use pestilence or plague in the place of murrain. Plague, like pestilence, refers to a deadly and widespread disease. Rabbinical commentaries call the pestilence death due to its lethality. The grievous murrain that affected the livestock of Egypt was death. It not only swept away great numbers of cattle, it killed all of them. Modern scholars try to force-fit a naturalistic explanation of what happened, but these explanations do not account for the totality of the catastrophe. The plague of murrain was not a cattle plague. At the same time the murrain was killing off all the cattle of Egypt, a plague of boils and blains was scourging the land. Like the murrain, dust was the irritant causing the blistering. This plague affected both man and animal. The boils and blains were another form of severe skin irritation caused by the toxic compounds in the dust. Most translations use festering boils instead of the King James boil breaking forth with blains. Either way, man and beast suffered with painful, pus-filled abscesses. The skin will blister for a number of reasons. In the case of the plague, the cause was a caustic chemical irritant or irritants in the dust. Nickel sulfate has been detected in Martian soil. Since both plagues were caused by the same agent, the red dust falling from Mars, they were simultaneous and not consecutive. The book of Job confirms that the plagues causing severe skin irritations extended beyond the borders of Egypt. Job lived in the land of Uz at the time of the Exodus. Scholars debate the identity and location of Uz. Many believe it to be associated with Edom or was Edom itself. For our purposes, we simply note that wherever Uz was not Egypt. It is therefore interesting to learn that Job, like the Egyptians, was smitten with boils from head to foot. Skin maladies, such as boils and murrain, did not cease with the plagues associated with them. The Israelites continued to suffer from various skin afflictions throughout their sojourn in the wilderness. The Lord warned His people as they prepared to cross the Jordan that He would inflict them with the botch of Egypt if they didn't obey His commandments. The Hebrew word translated as botch is the same word translated as boil in the sixth plague. The Lord's description of the promised pestilence is more detailed than the description of the plague and provides a better idea as to the nature of the disease. In addition to boils and blains, the pestilence caused a consumption, fever, inflammation, and extreme burning. Consumption refers to a condition where the body progressively wastes away. It used to be a name for tuberculosis, but this is not what the Mosaic account is referring to. The boils struck at the knees and legs, then eventually covered the body from foot to head. This mirrors the experience of Job, who suffered from boils over his entire body. All these skin diseases were caused by the red dust falling from Mars. The dust was small, as we know from the description of the plague of boils. Much of the dust was a fine powder. This is consistent with the physical properties of Martian dust, which is also very fine. A fine, powdery dust makes a perfect aerosol for long-duration suspension in the atmosphere. Large airborne particles, as would be expected, fall to Earth at a much more rapid pace than smaller particles. And we know that Mars is regularly subject to huge dust storms. These storms can last for months. Some of the storms are so large, they enshroud the entire planet in dust. The dust from the 2001 storm remained suspended in the Martian atmosphere for about 7 months. A similarly sized dust would remain much longer in the thicker atmosphere of Earth. The dust that fell from Mars covered immense tracts of Earth's surface, but the dust did not settle immediately. It took some time to reach the surface. The dust from the global storm of 2001 remained in the Martian atmosphere for months. Given the amount of debris falling on Earth and its thicker atmosphere, it would be reasonable to assume it took years for the air to clear. After all, the ash from Mount Pinatubo took 2 years to settle, and that was a minor event when compared to the Exodus. The prolonged suspension of the toxic dust would have ensured that its effects would continue for years. This would mean that the Israelites, Egyptians, and other inhabitants of the earth would experience skin disorders until the dust had fully settled. Unfortunately, even the complete settling of dust would not resolve the problem. The mammoth amount of dust coating the surface likely became a reservoir for terrestrial dust storms, not unlike the Sahara Desert. The annual dust storms of Mars would be duplicated on Earth. One of the signs that the Lord commanded Moses to use before Pharaoh was a leprous hand. The Hebrew translated as leprous by the King James translators is Sarah and means to be struck with leprosy or to be leprous. Now, most translations use leprosy or leprous for Sarah, but some do not, instead preferring a more general term such as skin disease. The New Living Translation uses a severe skin disease. The Holman Christian Standard Bible translates Sarah as diseased. The God's Word translation added an additional detail describing the diseased hand as flaky as snow. The translators preferred the texture of snow as the relevant characteristic over the color of snow. It is possible that both characteristics were descriptive of the disease. That some of the translators chose not to use leprous as a translation of the Hebrew Sarah begs an obvious question. Was the disease inflicting Moses' hand leprosy, as most translators believe, or was it something else as other translators believe? And if the disease was not leprosy, then what was it? After the Israelites had left Egypt and established themselves in the wilderness, Miriam was struck with leprosy. Her entire body became like snow, as had the hand of Moses. The original Hebrew is the same, Sarah. As in the case of Moses, translations of Sarah vary, with most translating it as leprous and others using disease or diseased. The New International Translation calls Sarah both leprous and a defiling skin disease, while Holman's simply uses diseased, and God's Word calls it an infectious disease. Again, we ask the question, was Miriam's disease leprosy or was it something else? To answer these questions, we must first define leprosy. What is leprosy, and does it fit the description in the Bible? Leprosy, as it is defined today, is a term for Hansen's disease, a long-term infection. Hansen's disease does produce skin lesions, but does not act like the disease called leprosy in the Bible. In fact, almost nothing about the biblical disease conforms to anything expected of Hansen's disease. If Sarah of the Bible is not Hansen's disease, which it clearly isn't, then what is it? The Bible gives clear descriptions of the effects of Sarah on the skin, yet historians can't find any known skin disease to connect it with. It remains an unidentified skin disorder. As part of the law of Moses, the Lord introduced specific laws for a disease. These were the laws of the plague of leprosy. In these laws, the Lord first identified the disease through its symptoms and then taught the children of Israel about its ritual cleanliness. But before going into specifics, there are important questions that need to be asked and answered. It is curious that the Lord found it necessary in His law of leprosy to first define what the disease was. He described the symptoms of scabs and boils in great detail, and then specified what was leprosy and what was not. But why would He need to do so? Didn't Israel already know what leprosy was? Furthermore, if leprosy was a common disease like Hansen's disease, wouldn't it have existed before the Exodus? Israel might not have known how to cure leprosy, but certainly there would have been instances of the disease before the Exodus. Yet Sarah, translated as leprosy, is first encountered in Leviticus. The fact that the Lord identified the forms of Sarah suggests that it was a new disease. He defined the disease in terms of its symptoms and pathology, as doctors do today with newly discovered diseases. The Lord does not specify the cause of the disease. This is odd, since the identification of the cause would be helpful in dealing with the disease. After all, in modern medical practice, the identification of a disease's pathogen is critical in determining successful therapies. Of course, the identification of the cause of SARA would not be necessary if the Israelites already knew what it was. There is good reason to believe that the children of Israel did know the exact pathogen for leprosy. The laws of leprosy do not identify the cause of the disease, SARA, but its detailed description does give sufficient information to identify its pathogen. First, SARA is not restricted to humans. The disease, oddly enough, can be contracted by clothing and houses. Both clothing and houses have separate laws of the plague. Scholars are at a loss as to explain even the possibility of diseased clothing or a diseased house. Nonetheless, the Lord was serious on the matter. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made specific laws for leprous garments and houses. Scholars are tempted to apply different diseases to the leprosy of the garments and houses than those afflicting humans. Generally speaking, what afflicts man does not afflict clothing and buildings, and vice versa. But the symptoms of the human leprosy and its treatment are the same as for the leprosy of the garments and house. This makes it certain that the disease and its cause was the same for all three. Second, the descriptions of the laws also make it clear that SARA, whatever it was not contagious. It was not passed from person to person. If it were contagious, the Lord would have given procedures to isolate those afflicted with the disease. But in many cases, lepers were allowed to intermingle with their fellow Israelites. The priest had direct contact with all those who contracted the disease. Those who had the disease, covered their body from head to foot, were pronounced clean by the priest. This means that the leper was allowed to freely associate. When there was leprosy in a house, the priest first instructed its owner to remove the furnishings so they would remain clean. There was no fear that the furniture had been contaminated by the house. Leprous clothing was not considered contagious either. The disease translated as leprosy, SARA, was simply not a contagion, nor was contact with the disease feared. Third, the SARA was curable. In some cases, merely waiting for 1 to 2 weeks was sufficient for the disease to resolve on its own. But modern leprosy, Hansen's disease, is for the most part incurable. Some cures now exist, but are costly and require up to a year for complete remission. The difficulty in identifying SARA lies in the fact that its symptoms do not match any known disease. Not only does it not match Hansen's disease, Sara does not match any known skin malady. Scholars work around this problem by saying that leprosy is a catch-all term for a variety of diseases. The Church, in its Bible dictionary, advances this claim. Furthermore, the blame for the modern inability to identify Sara lies with the ancients. Yet, the ancient Israelites knew exactly how to identify Sara after receiving the Lord's instructions. When it repeatedly reappeared, they knew what it was and what to do. That was the whole point of the laws. For example, when King Uzziah was smitten by the Lord with Sara, the priests immediately recognized it and took appropriate steps, casting the king out of the temple. The difficulty in the modern identification of Sara does not lie with the rudimentary medical knowledge of the ancients. After its appearance in clinical descriptions by the Lord, they readily identified the disease and knew how to treat it. Certainly, the Lord knew what Sara was. The difficulty lies with the assumptions of modern scholars. Historians automatically assume that Sara must be a disease we see today. While this assumption is logical, it is not supported by the biblical record. The truth of the matter is that Sara was not a disease as we define the term today. Sara does not presently exist. This being the case, it is a pointless exercise to try to identify it with any known disease. The Israelites believed, and the scriptures bear this out, that Sara was an affliction sent by the Lord. It was akin to the plagues of murrain and boils inflicted upon Egypt. The ancient Israelites didn't look upon Sara as a disease per se. They believed it to be a judgment sent by God. This is understandable given the fact that every leper mentioned in the Old Testament, beginning with Miriam, got the disease from God due to transgression. The notion that Sara was a curse from God initially came from God Himself. It was God Himself that put leprosy into a house. Throughout the laws, the Lord repeatedly calls Sara a nega. The King James translates nega as plague. Other translations, however, translate the term differently, including infection, disease, and stroke. The translation, plague of leprosy, evokes the idea of a runaway infectious disease, a pandemic on the order of historic plagues, such as the Black Death of the Middle Ages. But Sara was not communicable. The root meaning of nega suggests something different. Nega literally means stroke. It is derived from the verb naga, which means to deliver a blow. To strike assumes an active and purposeful actor behind the action. Delivering a blow, striking, generally assumes an assailant, a target, and a reason for the action. When combined with disease, to strike means to purposely inflict with a pestilence. In the Old Testament, disease was always a blow delivered by an angry God. Nega was used to describe the Lord's plaguing Pharaoh for desiring Abram's wife, Sarai. The King James Version translated nega in its usual manner as plague. Other translations substituted struck or inflicted. Just before slaying the firstborn, the Lord used nega to describe the act along with its preceding plagues. Where the King James and other versions translate nega as plague, the New Living Translation provides a more literal translation. The 10 plagues of Israel were strokes or blows delivered by God upon the Egyptians for Pharaoh's refusal to let Israel go. Sarah, like the 10 plagues, was a blow and a stroke. It was delivered by God. The Lord doesn't strike or deliver a blow without a reason. There was good reason to strike Pharaoh and the Egyptians, both at the time of Abram and at the Exodus. The stroke of Sarah was also purposeful. Those stricken with the disease became defiled and unclean. They were separated from the body of the camp. And while we know the reasons for being stricken with Sarah for some, such as Miriam, Joab, and Uzziah, the laws do not specify the whys of the uncleanliness. Still, those affected and pronounced unclean by the priest were assumed to have sinned and polluted themselves. Sarah was an outward manifestation of inner corruption. The Hebrew translated as unclean is tameh and means to become morally contaminated. Sarah, translated as leprosy, like the plagues of Egypt, was a blow or strike delivered by the Lord. It appeared for the first time at the Exodus at a time when Egypt was afflicted with all manner of skin diseases. Like the plagues, Sarah broke out in boils, tumors, and scabs. At this point, it becomes reasonable to ask a simple question. If Sarah was identical to the skin plagues of Egypt, its boils the same as the boils of Egypt, then isn't it likely that its cause was the same? If so, we should find evidence to support this conclusion. We know that the toxic agent that caused the grievous murrain and boils and blains of Egypt was the poisonous dust raining down on the country from the planet Mars. Is there any evidence that dust was the pathogen causing leprosy in man, clothing, and houses? Though the scriptures do not explicitly link the dust to Sarah in relation to its effects upon humans, they do make a direct connection between the dust and the leprosy of houses. When a house was declared unclean with the plague, the priest was directed to shut the house up for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest was to return and inspect the house, and more specifically, the walls. If the plague had spread, then he was to have the dust scraped from the walls and thrown into an unclean place outside the city. That the plague was in the walls of the house and that it was dust that was scraped off the walls and tossed into the unclean place provides a firm basis for believing that the dust was the pathogen for leprous houses. The dust from the walls itself was considered unclean. Moreover, it makes sense that something like dust would be the agent for houses. The Martian dust would likely adhere to the walls and stones of houses, and its acidity would react with the walls, eating them away and causing streaking and depressions. Mars' toxic dust would likely infiltrate cloth of all types. It would eat at the cloth as it did the walls. The biblical text states that the sorrow was in the cloth and that the cloth itself became infected. This wasn't a case of the cloth acting as a carrier or a dormant disease. Dust, as pathogen, also explains the shaving of hair. The man cleansed of sorrow was required to shave his entire body twice, along with washing his clothes and body. By shaving off all the hair, including beards and eyebrows, this would ensure that there was not remaining impurity. It would also make sure that any dust that worked its way into the hair would also be removed. Washing the body and the clothes would also remove any lingering dust. The Sara and other diseases were devastating to Egypt. The murrain killed all Egypt's cattle. All the fish in the river Nile and in the waters of Egypt died from the bloody dust. Though not stated, the effect on the human population of Egypt must have been equally ruinous. The Lord intimated that if he had let the pestilence run its course, Egypt would have been wiped from the face of the earth. The only reason that God let Pharaoh and his people survive was that God wanted his power and name known throughout the world. Egypt was not the only target for God's power and message. The pestilence of Egypt will return at the second coming. The red dust of Mars will again cause sores, boils, and death. Just as Pharaoh hardened his heart against the power of God, so will man when faced with the same power and with the same deadly consequences. Jesus Christ repeatedly warned of great calamities that will strike the world at his latter-day return. Among these desolations will be a pestilence. When Moroni visited Joseph Smith 4 times in one night, on the second visit, the messenger repeated the Savior's warnings of great judgments that would come. Pestilence was one of them. These warnings were intended to inform righteous saints so they could prepare and survive. The pestilence will be a desolating sickness which will cover the earth, but the Lord's disciples will save themselves by standing in holy places. The Lord has called the scourge that will end all nations a consumption. Consumption is the historical term for tuberculosis, a disease which literally consumes the body. But the Lord is not talking about tuberculosis. It is not the body that will be consumed by the plague, but the entire world. The earth is being consumed of its life. The Lord decreed the consumption of the entire earth long ago. Isaiah knew of the decree and prophesied its certain finality. Modern translations of Isaiah's prophecy highlight the point that the Lord, before the time of Isaiah, had made a determination to consume the earth. By using his military title, Lord of Hosts, the Savior is signaling that the consumption will be brought to pass by his heavenly host, the planets. It will be the planets, specifically Mars, that will consume the earth. The Apostle Paul spoke of Isaiah's prophecy of a latter-day consumption in his letter to the Romans. He repeated the prophecy in Greek, which changes the meaning of the Hebrew original. Paul is emphasizing the swiftness by which the Lord will carry out his decree and the righteousness of his justice. The Greek translated by the King James translators as cut short is more clearly rendered as execute speedily. In righteousness refers to justness of the judgment. The Lord used the same wording as the apostle in a revelation to Joseph Smith concerning the scourge. He said the plague will be cut short in righteousness. If we apply the sense of Paul's original Greek to the modern revelation, then it would read something like this. The high mortality rate and global extent of the future consumption qualify it as a pandemic in its general sense. There have been numerous pandemics throughout the history of the world, the most deadly being the Black Death or bubonic plague and the 1918 Spanish influenza. The pandemic of the apocalypse will far exceed any past pandemic. The Spanish flu is believed to have killed about 3 to 5% of the world's population. It is estimated that the Black Death killed 30 to 60% of the inhabitants of Europe. But as deadly as those pandemics were, the coming consumption will empty the earth, taking the lives of almost all the inhabitants of the earth. There are a number of deadly plagues recorded in the historical accounts. Yet there is at least one pandemic that, although it has been recorded, is not considered a pandemic by modern historians: the pestilence of Egypt. The pestilence of Egypt must have been a pandemic, given it was a mirror event of the consumption of the apocalypse. The Lord chose to limit the effects of the pestilence, but made it clear that he could have easily used the disease to wipe out all Egypt. Historians likely do not recognize the pandemic nature of the plague of boils, since it does not fit their preconception that pandemic diseases must be communicable. Many discount the plagues entirely as fanciful. Modern healthcare professionals believe they can mitigate the effects of future pandemic through thorough planning and an effective and coordinated response. The World Health Organization is currently building an international system for responding to any future pandemic, especially pandemic influenza. The U.S. government is stockpiling vaccines for select influenza viruses that could be used in the event of a pandemic. The Center for Disease Control, CDC, has developed non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, to help slow a pandemic while new vaccines are being developed. NPIs include such strategies as isolation, face masks, and personal hygiene. But none of this planning and preparation will matter when the consumption of the apocalypse strikes the Earth. There is no vaccine that can counter the poisonous dust from Mars. It will be pointless to limit contact between each other when the disease comes from a planet above. You cannot quarantine a planet. Man cannot save himself from the coming pandemic, but the Lord has provided means of safety for His saints. We have already noted that the Lord will appoint holy places of refuge. The Lord has given the saints another means of protection from the destroying angel, the planet Mars. It is called the Word of Wisdom. The Word of Wisdom was given to Joseph Smith in February of 1833 and provides the Lord's wisdom concerning food, what is appropriate for consumption and what is not appropriate. If the saints obey the counsel found in the Revelation, they will receive health and endurance. It was designed for the temporal salvation of the saints in the latter days. Obedience to the word of wisdom will provide protection against the designs of evil men in the latter days. Beyond that promise is another one for the coming apocalypse. For those who obey the principles of the word of wisdom, they will be protected from the destroying angel who will pass by them as it did during the Exodus. That destroying angel is the planet Mars. But those seeking the benefit of this promise must understand that they are to keep the sayings and commandments found in section 89. The so-called Word of Wisdom standards for the temple recommend are not sufficient and do not reflect the Lord's sayings and commandments in His revelation.